Before Rome became the heart of an empire, there was the hope of a people looking for a new chance. Imagine the scenario: Troy, a great city, burns in flames, its heroes fall and its walls crumble. Amidst the chaos, Aeneas, a Trojan prince, feels the weight of an overwhelming responsibility. He was not only fleeing his ruined homeland, but taking with him the last spark of his people. Every step he took was like a promise that Troy would not die with its ruins. Behind her courage was fear and uncertainty. How do you find a new home when everything you know has been destroyed? Years of wandering, looking for a future, but with the wounds of the past still open. When Aeneas finally arrived in Latium, he not only felt the relief of having a place to call home. He felt that his destiny and that of Troy were intertwined with those lands. He got married, founded a new city, Lavinius, and with that began to rebuild what he had lost. However, as is always the case, the shadows of the past are never far away. Aeneas' descendants, although heirs to a heroic legacy, faced their own battles. Numitor, the legitimate king of Alba Longa, was betrayed by his own brother, Amulius. For Numitor, the pain was not just in the loss of the throne, but in the betrayal of blood, something that carries a wound that never completely heals. But Amulius's cruelty did not stop there. He forced Numitor's daughter Rhea Silvia to become a virgin priestess, believing this would eliminate any risk of her lineage continuing. Little did he know that destiny had other plans. Romulus and Remus were born, and for Amulius, they were not just two defenseless babies, they were a threat to his reign. The fear of losing everything he had stolen led him to order the boys to be thrown into the Tiber River. Now, imagine for a moment, two babies, completely at the mercy of a treacherous river, the uncertainty of their lives floating along with the current. For anyone else, that would be the end, but not for Romulus and Remus. Carried away by the waters, the twins were miraculously spared. The basket that protected them stopped on the banks of the river, at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, something unexpected happened. A she-wolf, a beast that would normally inspire fear, found them and, in an unusual gesture of compassion, cared for them. It's difficult to imagine the mixture of strength and tenderness that surrounded that scene, the raw and savage nature, protecting those who were destined to change the world. How could these babies know, then, that they were being prepared for something much greater? His early years were lived among the silence of the hills and the protection of an unlikely mother. When the pastor Faustulus found them, he and his wife Laurentia raised them as if they were their own children. Romulus and Remus grew up, unaware of the tragedy that had surrounded them at their birth, but always with a deep feeling that they were destined for more than that simple life of shepherds. With each passing day, they felt a restlessness within them, as if something was calling them beyond the hills, to a future they could not yet fully understand. They were fearless young people, full of life, but with a shadow of mystery about who they really were. Finally, the truth came out. Romulus and Remus were not just sons of shepherds, they were grandsons of Numitor, the deposed king of Alba Longa. The discovery came as a blow. The life they thought was simple was permeated with injustice and betrayal. And the worst, the man who had sentenced them to death was his own uncle. For them, this was not just a matter of revenge. It was a question of justice. Amulius had taken everything from his family, and now they were ready to take it back. The blood in his veins was not common. They knew they were destined for something greater, but before they could create a future, they needed to correct the past. Upon discovering their true origins, Romulo and Remus were overcome by a mixture of confused and intense feelings. The life they had lived until then, as simple shepherds in the hills, seemed like a lie. Every happy childhood memory, the affection they received from Faustulus and Laurentia, everything now had a new weight. As much as they loved their adoptive family, they couldn't ignore what they had lost. They knew that their lives had been marked by the pain of betrayal, the deepest betrayal of all. Their hearts pulsed with a growing desire for justice, but also with the contained anger at having been deprived of their roots, of their family history, of the throne that had been denied to them. While organizing a group of followers, Romulo and Remus felt their anxiety increasing every moment. It wasn't just courage that guided them, but the feeling that they were about to face something much bigger than themselves. The fear was there, in the shadows, but the desire to do justice for Numitor, his grandfather, was greater. The path to Alba Longa was marked by determined looks and words that could barely hide the tension that gripped them. And how could they not feel that way? They were not just going to fight a tyrant, but the man who had tried to destroy their lives before they had even begun. When they finally arrived at Alba Longa, Romulo's heart beat faster. Remus, by his side, breathed deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility. The smell of the earth, the murmurs of the wind, everything seemed more alive at that moment. They knew that this battle would not only be physical, but also emotional. Every blow they would strike would not just be to conquer a throne, but to recover everything that was stolen from them, the right to their history, their name, their identity. When the fight ended and Amulius was defeated, there was not only relief but also a deep sense of emptiness. Although they had won, Romulus and Remus knew that their true journey was just beginning. With Alba Longa restored and Numitor back on the throne, Romulus and Remus could have been content. After all, they had avenged their family, taken back what was rightfully theirs, and brought justice to the city. However, something within them remained restless. It was not just the thirst for power, but a feeling that something was missing, a greater mission yet to be fulfilled. The victory in Alba Longa felt like the end of one stage, but also the beginning of another. They had done justice for their grandfather, but now they needed to make their own mark on the world. A mark that would make them immortal. It was then that the idea of founding a new city began to take shape. For Romulus and Remus, this was more than just raising walls and building houses, it was creating a legacy that would last forever. They wanted a place that reflected their values, their courage, and that was a true extension of everything they had faced so far. Each of them carried a different vision of what this city should be. Romulo dreamed of a strong city, with laws and military power that would make it unbeatable. Remo believed that the city should be more inclusive, a space of harmony between people, where everyone could live fairly. With these ideas in mind, the two brothers began exploring the region in search of the perfect place to found this new city. They returned to the banks of the Tiber River, where their story had begun. There, on the Palatine Hill, where the wolf had found them years before, something seemed to call to them. It was as if destiny was guiding his steps back to the place where it all began. They decided that there, among those hills, was where they would build the city that would change the world. However, the shared dream would soon turn into a bitter rivalry. Both wanted to be the founder and leader of the new city, and ambition began to poison the bond that had always united them. In the end, the situation got completely out of control. What began as a dispute of ideas and visions soon turned into a physical confrontation that would change their fates forever. During the construction of the new city's walls, Remus, in an impulsive gesture of defiance, jumped onto the foundations that Romulus had erected. In that moment, what Remus wanted to say was clear: these walls, which you value so much, will not stop me. You cannot control everything. For him, it was a provocation, a last-ditch effort to show that the city should be more open and free. But, for Romulo, it was like a deep wound, a blow to the heart of his dream. Romulo's anger rose like an uncontrollable fire. He was already tired of the arguments, exhausted from the constant dispute. In the heat of the moment, he barely realized what he was doing. His movements were quick, instinctive, and, in the blink of an eye, the inevitable happened. Remus fell to the ground. When Romulus looked at his brother's body, the world around him seemed to freeze. The silence weighed like a stone. The blood on the ground, the same ground where they were supposed to build a city together, now seemed an indelible mark of loss. Time, which once seemed to run so fast as they built their new city, has now stopped. What had he done? Seeing Remus lifeless, Romulus did not feel the victory of a leader, but rather the devastation of a brother. He fell to his knees beside the body, his heart sinking, his hands shaking. The weight of the act fell upon him with crushing force. That wasn't the victory he wanted. He had not defeated an enemy, he had taken the life of someone who had always been by his side, someone who shared his pain, his dreams, his blood. Repentance came like an overwhelming wave, and in that moment Romulus knew that although he was the founder of Rome, his life would never be the same. Rome would be his creation, but the price paid for it would be a scar he would carry forever. The days following Remus' death were enveloped in a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Romulus, now the sole founder of Rome, walked through the hills feeling a deep emptiness. Every stone he moved to build the walls, every command he gave his men, everything seemed marked by the weight of loss. The foundations of Rome were being built, but he could not ignore that, with every stone, there was a guilt that could never be removed. Rome was being born, but at his brother's expense. He wondered, in the midst of his hard work, whether the sacrifice had really been necessary. Even with a heavy heart, Romulus knew he couldn't give up. Everyone's eyes were on him. His followers expected leadership, determination, strength. And he, although torn inside, took on this responsibility. Rome, he thought, couldn't just be a city, it had to be a symbol, an indestructible force. Romulus decided that the walls he was building would not only be physical barriers, but would also represent Rome's power over the world. Remus' blood, although painful, had sealed a great fate. He promised himself that Rome would be as eternal as the pain he now carried in his chest. But the nights were the worst. In the silence of the darkness, when work stopped and the men slept, Romulus was alone with his thoughts. He remembered Remus, the laughs they shared, the moments when, together, they dreamed of changing the world. Now, Remus was no longer there. The city that was being born was their legacy, but he could never share this triumph with his brother. Rome would be the greatest empire in history, but for Romulus, it would always carry the shadow of a personal tragedy. The founding of Rome was his destiny, but the loss of Remus was the price he would never stop paying. With Rome finally built, Romulus found himself facing a new challenge, transforming a jumble of houses and walls into a strong and prosperous society. The surrounding hills were now protected, but the real work began there. The city needed order, laws, and, above all, people. Romulus knew that it was not enough to just build a physical city, he needed to create a place where people wanted to live, where they felt part of something bigger. But the question remained, how to attract people to such a new place with no history. Romulus decided that Rome would be a refuge for all those who, for some reason, had nowhere to go. He opened the city's doors to exiles, fugitives and even criminals. For him, the past of these people didn't matter, what mattered was what they would do from that moment on. Rome would be a place of new beginnings. Those who arrived in the city were not only welcomed, they found the opportunity to start over. This is how Rome began to grow, with a mixture of people from different backgrounds, each bringing their own stories and skills. Rome, from the beginning, was a city of diversity, and it was this mix that made it so strong and resilient. However, Romulus soon realized that it was not enough to just attract people. He needed a structure, rules that would guarantee order and the functioning of the city. He created a system where everyone had a role to play, dividing inhabitants into groups with specific roles. To maintain control and peace, he established laws, many of them inspired by ancient customs that he had known during his life as a shepherd. Romulus did not rule with an iron fist, but he knew that, without discipline, the city would not survive. His leadership, now firmly established, was shaped by the grief and lessons learned from the loss of Remus. Rome was growing, but it was missing something essential to guarantee its future: women. Without women, the city could not survive beyond a generation. Romulus, realizing the problem, knew he needed to act. He tried to negotiate with neighboring peoples, asking for alliances and marriages to unite the cities. However, Rome was still seen as a city of outsiders, exiles and fugitives, and none of the surrounding kingdoms were willing to mix their families in such a new and uncertain place. The rejection was a hard blow, and the feeling of isolation began to weigh even more heavily on Romulus. It was then that Romulus made a bold but controversial decision. He organized a great festival, inviting neighboring peoples, especially the Sabines, to celebrate in Rome. The party would be a demonstration of hospitality, an attempt to show that Rome was not a threat, but rather a place of good intentions. However, behind the party, there was a dark plan. During the celebrations, while the Sabines were distracted by music and wine, the men of Rome received a sign from Romulus. In a quick and coordinated movement, the Romans kidnapped the Sabine women, taking them into the city and preventing any immediate reaction from their parents and brothers. The act was shocking. The Sabines, taken from their families, were terrified. At first, all seemed lost for them, and the feeling of betrayal and despair spread among the women and men of Rome. Romulo, however, acted quickly. He didn't want these women to be just prisoners, he wanted them to be part of the city. He promised that they would be respected, treated with honor and their rights guaranteed. Over time, some of the Sabines began to adapt to life in Rome, seeing that the Romans, despite their brutal methods, wanted to build something solid. The festival, which began as a trap, ended up being the first step towards unity between the Sabines and the Romans. But peace was still far away. The kidnapping would not go unpunished. The furious Sabines joined forces to attack Rome and recover their daughters and sisters. And so, the confrontation between the two peoples approached, testing not only Rome's military strength, but also Romulus' diplomacy and ability as a leader. The news of the abduction of the Sabine women spread quickly throughout the neighboring kingdoms. The Sabines' wounded pride could not be ignored, and their families cried out for revenge. Strong, experienced men gathered under the leadership of King Titus Tatius, determined to rescue his daughters and sisters by force. Rome, which was still young and without a great military tradition, would face its first major external threat. For Romulus, that moment would define whether Rome would survive or be crushed before it even gained a foothold. When the Sabine army marched towards Rome, Romulus knew he was facing an immense challenge. He prepared his defenses and gathered the men, who had grown up with him, from the early days of the city's founding. But something weighed on his heart. It wasn't just a matter of winning a battle. Romulus understood that if Rome defeated the Sabines by force, the ties between the two peoples would be forever severed, and the young city would remain isolated in a hostile world. When the confrontation seemed inevitable and the armies were ready to fight, something unexpected happened. The Sabine women themselves, those who had been kidnapped, placed themselves between the two armies. With tears in their eyes, they begged for a peaceful solution. Although they had been forcibly brought to Rome, many of them had now raised families in the city. They were wives and mothers, divided between two worlds, that of their past and that of their present. His words touched both the Sabines and the Romans. "If you fight," they said, "we will lose once again, we will lose our fathers and our husbands." Faced with this appeal, King Titus Tassio and Romulo were forced to reconsider. Neither of them wanted more blood. So a deal was made. Sabines and Romans joined forces, and the two peoples became one. The reign of Rome would now be shared by Romulus and Titus Tatius, marking the beginning of an alliance that would further strengthen the city. Rome, previously isolated and seen as a city of exiles, now began to become a power in the region, a city capable of creating new alliances and adapting to circumstances. As the years passed, Romulus consolidated his position as the supreme leader of Rome. Under his command, the city grew, both in power and influence. The alliance with the Sabines had brought stability, and Rome, once a refuge for exiles, was beginning to establish itself as a respected force. However, the joint reign with Tito Tassio was short-lived. Titus, despite the alliance, was killed in a dispute with Roman allies during a conflict involving commercial interests. With his death, Romulus returned to governing Rome alone, and remained so until the end of his life. As Rome flourished under his rule, Romulus seemed increasingly distant. The scars of the past, especially the loss of Remus and the burden of ruling, weighed on him. Governing was a burden, and the weight of his own legacy seemed to grow every day. He became more reserved, more introspective, as if the ghosts of his choices haunted him constantly. Although Rome was prospering, something inside Romulus began to change. Romulus' final days were shrouded in mystery. In a public ceremony, where the king was among his citizens and nobles, a sudden storm violently covered the sky. The wind roared, and dark clouds swallowed the city. When the storm passed, Romulo had simply disappeared. For some, he had been taken by the gods, ascending to the heavens as a deity. Others whispered that he had been murdered by the senators themselves, who feared the growth of his power. What really happened to Romulus that day became an enigma that persisted for generations. His body was never found, and uncertainty about his end fueled the legend. The most widespread version was that he had not died as an ordinary man, but had ascended as Quirinus, a protective deity of Rome. This belief transformed Romulus into more than a king. He became an eternal symbol, who would guide Rome forever. Even with his disappearance, Romulo's legacy remained alive in every part of the city. His laws, his strength, and the spirit he breathed into Rome continued to shape the city. He had created not just a kingdom, but an identity. What began as a small village was now the center of something much larger, and the story of Romulus, mixed with legend, became the basis of a Rome that aspired to eternity. Rome would grow far beyond his expectations, but Romulus' name would never be forgotten. He would always be remembered as the founder who, with his own hands and sacrifices, shaped a city destined to be the heart of the world. After the mysterious disappearance of Romulus, Rome continued its growth trajectory. The city he had founded, with its walls built on a past full of pain and sacrifices, began to expand, absorbing more and more territories and influences. The figure of Romulus, now immortalized as the first king and, according to many, a god, became central to the Roman spirit. He was no longer seen just as the founder of the city, but as an example of what Rome should be: strong, resilient, and ready to face any adversity. The legend of Romulus and Remus was told from generation to generation, not just as an origin story, but as a lesson in the importance of courage and sacrifice. Romulus had killed his own brother to found Rome, which, although tragic, also served to show Romans that sometimes great deeds required difficult decisions. This vision of relentless strength would be reflected in future leaders, who would make equally tough decisions in the name of Rome's growth. The city that was born from a family conflict would make conflict, whether in wars or political disputes, a central part of its identity. Over the centuries, Rome became the heart of an empire that spread across the Mediterranean. Even when the system of government changed, and the republic replaced the monarchy, the legend of Romulus continued to inspire Roman citizens. The myth helped to unify the city in times of crisis, reminding everyone that Rome was created to be eternal, destined to rule. Each new general, each new emperor, saw Romulus as the model to be followed. Their values, strength, resilience, and belief that Rome would always prevail, shaped the character of a civilization that believed in its destiny to rule the world. Centuries later, when Rome came to be ruled by emperors such as Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius, the legend of Romulus still echoed in the hearts of the Romans. Emperors were often compared to the first king, being seen as his divine heirs, men destined to continue Romulus' legacy and expand Rome's power even further. Even with all the changes, Romulus' founding of the city remained the basis of Roman identity, the belief that, like its founder, Rome could face and overcome any obstacle. In the end, Romulus' true legacy was not just the city itself, but the spirit he left behind. The Eternal City, as it became known, survived empires, revolutions, and even its own fall. But the story of Romulus and Remus, with its tragedies and triumphs, continued to be told, reminding the world that Rome, like its first king, would never be forgotten. Thus, the legend of Romulus, the king who was born in a cradle of water, raised by a she-wolf, and who founded Rome at his own brother's expense, grew into something greater. Rome, the city he built, became the center of an empire that shaped history. And, to this day, his name and his spirit live on, not just in the ruins of the ancient city, but in the culture and legacy that Rome left to the world. Are you enjoying the content? Leave a comment with a topic you'd like to see covered in the next videos. Your opinion is very important to us.